Hello and welcome back to the Java series. We're going to be starting on a new project today which explains several basic structures and things in Java that are going to be very useful in our coming projects. So the first thing we're going to go over is methods. Then we're going to go over variable types and conditionals, and then finally go over loops and how all that fits together. That way we'll have all the skills necessary for the next project, which is going to be a guessing game. Okay, so we're going to go create a new project, which is a Java project. And we're going to name this one, how about variables, loops, and conditionals, or for short, VLC. And we're going to create a new class within this project and name this one VLC as well. Although with lowercase in it as well, so we can tell the difference. And so when you first get a project opened up, you get one thing inside your project, which is a public static void main argument. This is a method, and it's the main method. It's the one that the program looks for and always starts inside of. You can have multiple classes within a project, and they can all work together to accomplish a goal, but you can only have one main method, like this. So you can also execute instructions within this main method, but the most common practice is to go ahead and run things within the class method. So we're going to do that today. And so this, oh, sorry about that. So this is a method call, which then calls to the method we're going to create up here called public VLC. And this one gets curly brackets because our code is going to go within it. And you can also add arguments within here, say, and this here is a set of arguments that could be taken in from the system console, but we're not going to deal with that until possibly much later, probably in the advanced series. So if you wanted to do some sort of computation and then give that computation over here to this method, then it could be passed through on those. And then you can also return functions as well, which we'll go over here in a minute. Alright, so we're going to go over some basic data types before we get into methods, so we can use those to show how methods work and how you can use them. Okay, so the first type, a data type we're going to go over is a Boolean, which is simply either a true or false value. And it always has to be lowercase true or false. And the second type we have is a int. So that is a number that is less than 32 bits long. So it gives you a large variety of numbers, and most numbers that you try and put in will fit within an int, but sometimes you will have to go to a long, which is twice the length. So your number could be like 64. And your long could be, it's like 7. That's even still within the integer range, but oh, we forgot our variable in here. 2, how about that? And then you can have a floating point number, and let's name that one FLT. That's going to be a number that has a decimal in it, so it could be like 1.2. and you have to make sure that you put this f at the end, otherwise it will try and throw an error, because it automatically assumes that they're much bigger, which is where a double comes in. And that is just a very big float, as long as a very big integer. And those can be like, well, they can be twice as long because they're 64 bits instead of 32. And so we can put in a number like, oh, I don't know, 1.236, and then to the power of, or e to the, what, 300? Or how about 200? And then make sure to put the d on the end so it knows what it is. So those are the basic types. You can also have a char, which is a single character, and that uses single quotes. And let's put in the char, how about capital H, because I like capital H. And if you want to have multiple chars in an array, then you can either use a string, which is usually the easiest, or a char array. And we'll get into arrays a little bit later within the series when we have to start using them for some of the other projects that'll come along. So we're going to create a string, and we're going to name that str. And that has to use double quotes, and then you can put in, right, like the name of my channel, and a close bracket, or colon. And there you have it. So those are several different variable types that you can use. And if you wanted to pass those into a method, then what you can do is, the first thing you can do is you can also have things that are global within the class. So they can go up here, and then anything within the entire class can see it, which can be useful sometimes, although it is not always the preferred method. So the method that we usually use is, if you want to pass them into a new method, then you can pass them as a variable, or an argument. So down here we're going to create a method, public void, because it's not going to return anything at the moment, and variables. And then in here we're going to pass in, let's see, we are going to want, how about num int, and this doesn't have to be the same as what you're going to pass in, it just has to be the same as what you're going to put down below. So how about int, how about int1? I'm great at naming things. And then int2. And then open our brackets here. And then we can put whatever we want down here. So if we wanted to put in a new integer, int3, or how about we'll name it result. And result equals int1 plus int2. And you can do any kind of math in here. And there's functions for higher end math and things that we can get into later, which are very useful for that. And then we're going to take result, and we're going to pass it back, which is what a return is. So at the moment, this doesn't have to do anything. It doesn't have to return anything. But if we wanted to return an integer, then we could do int, change that to int, and then it will have to return an int. So then we go return result. and then it will pass result back up to where we call it. So we can either call variables and then put in, let's see, num and num2, and then it will pass those down here, and then we can use them. But because num2 is a long instead, it will try and throw an error here because it's not what it's looking for. So we can go about this two ways, and that is either changing this to an integer or changing this to a long. And either would work in this case, but I'm going to change this to an integer just to make things simple. And so then variables gets both of those from up here, passes them down here, does the math, and then it can return them to right here. But what we can also do down here is print it out. And the fast way to do what we did in tutorial 1, which was printing out hello world, is you can, in Eclipse at least, you can go sysout, sysout, and then hit Control plus the spacebar, and it will autofill in the rest of the line for you. So you can either type in here, and you can do math and addition, if you will, within print lines as well. So we're going to put in here the result is, then put a colon in here and a space, and then outside of the brackets, space plus space, and then result. And then we can save this and run it. And then it will say the result is 7,064, which is correct. Now, if we wanted to not print it out here, and by the way, this is a comment so that it won't run any of this code and it will ignore it. You can also use this to write notes to yourself about what things do, which is a good idea. And then, so it won't print anything out down here, and it will still return result back up here. So then we can say int new result. We could use the same name as down here, but it doesn't have to be. Int new result equals this. And then we can go down here and sysout new result. And then when we run it, it will give us the number again. We can also, instead of saving the variable and then calling it back again, we can just take this function and put it in here. And then say, the result is variables. And then it will give us the same line again. So that's basically how variables work. And it's pretty simple once you get used to it. Methods are easy to use and they help contain all your code and make everything easy to view. And the next thing we're going to get into is conditionals, which are a lot of fun. Okay, so in order to do a conditional, we're going to go down here, and I'm going to create a new method so we keep everything contained, if you will. So we're going to make public void conditionals. And we're going to pass in a couple things. We're going to pass in we're going to pass in int num num2, just for numbers to be able to work with. So the first and most obvious kind of conditional that we can use is an if statement. So you can go if num1, or num, is greater than num2, then it will do this. There. Otherwise, if it isn't, and you can have as many else statements or else if statements you want, so you can have else if num space equals, and you have to have two equal signs when you do a comparative statement like this. If they equal each other, then do something else. And then down here you can have a catch-all else statement, which says else do nothing, or something if you choose. And this is a great method of being able to decide what to do based on factors that come in. And it's pretty easy to write an if and else if tree like this. However, if you have a function that's more complicated than that, like if you have to make a decision based on numbers 1 through 6 or something, then you can also use a switch case statement, which works pretty well for certain things. So we're going to create a variable up here, which is a month. And that's going to be a string. And we're going to, for the moment, make it equal to December, because that's the month that it is at the moment of the creation of this video. And then we're going to create a switch case statement. So in the top, we have a switch statement here with month in it. And inside of this, we have a whole bunch of different cases. And the case here is, January. And then there are multiple, and of course, quotes, because it's a piece of data and not a variable. So if it's January, then we are going to print out, I don't know, it's cold. And then we can have another case. And we can have February. And so on. And we can also have down here a return that'll let it skip to the bottoms. But in this case, we don't really need one because it's not going to be more than one of these things. But we'll go ahead and put it in anyways, so because it's good practice. And that's a break statement. And here we're going to print out the same thing again because I'm lazy. And we're also going to break here. Oh, and we have to put this at the end. And then we're going to write the last case here because I'm going to skip the rest of them. And December. And December is going to say I don't know, it's snowing, even though it isn't at the moment. And then we can put a note to ourselves in here, add other functions later. And other than just printing things out, you can also do other things that, like calling methods or doing math inside and adding and subtracting from numbers. You could also be setting a integer to 1 and 2 and 3 and so on if this was a piece of user input. And then that user input would be able to transcode the months into numerical data that your program could use, which can be very useful at some times. And always the last thing you need is a case statement at the bottom, which is the default. And in that default statement, you're going to have a function that says that's not a month or something. And then the user will be able to put in a new set of data, and it would fix everything, theoretically. So that's a switch case statement. And they can be very useful, although not a lot of people like to use them because they are often very lengthy, and they have very few uses that they're really good and really tailored to. This month situation is a really good one for it. But oftentimes they get disregarded and forgotten about. So they're one of my favorite statements because it allows you to basically do a lot of if statements really fast. And if you have to do that, it works very well. So the next thing we're going to go over is a couple loops. And those are going to... Oh, we forgot to run our code because we have to make sure it works, which is always a good thing. So we're going to call the statement up here conditionals. And since it has inputs, so we're going to do num1 and num and num2 because that's what we put in. So we put in two integers, which we end up doing this up here, which we didn't actually even write any statements for. We could put in here a sysout and say the numbers, or say num1 is less than num2. Because that's essentially what it comes down to. And then we're going to go ahead and run it, and it will tell us that num1 is less than num2 because that's the only function left, and num1 is indeed less than num2, and it will tell us it's snowing because it's December, even though it isn't snowing. So that's basically how conditionals work, and those are the two most basic types of conditionals. And when we start talking about loops, loops are often based on conditionals as well, although they don't have to be, but it's a good way to write multiple or loops that keep on going until something happens, and that's often how these are used. Okay, so loops. We're going to also create another method for them just to keep things organized. So public void, oops. And inside this, I don't think I'm going to need to pass any variables in, so we're going to just start with a while loop. And a while loop goes until something happens, or until the statement inside is no longer true. So we can go in here and say while bool from the top up here. Remember, it's global, so we can use that. And we can say while bool equals true. And then in here, we can go sys out working, and then how about plus, I don't know, num times, which is going to be the number of times this loop is run. And in here, then we can have num times plus, we can either do +1 or num times equals num times +1. And num times should be defined out here, because otherwise if we define it in here, then it will get rewritten every time the loop runs. Because at the end of a loop, everything inside gets thrown away, unless it's declared up above. So that's why we're going to declare the integer up here. And we can declare it as null, which means we don't have to give it an value. However, if we're going to not declare it as a number in here, then we're going to have to initialize it to 0, essentially, letting it know what to start at. Otherwise, when it tries to run this, then it is going to come up against a null pointer because it's declared as null. Okay, and so if we have num times equal to num times +1, which works perfectly fine, there's also a shorthand way to do this, where we can shorten the entire thing by going plus equals 1, which is a simpler way to write things, and it's less characters, especially for us lazy people. Okay, so the next thing on here is we're going to put an if statement in. If num times is greater than, how about 20? And then we're going to do here and make bool equal false, which works perfectly fine. We're going to save that and run it. Oh, we also forgot to put something up here, which would be to call the function. There we go. And run it. And it ran to 21, which is odd. You know why? Is because it will run once before it adds something to it, and then run through here, and then set it to false, and then it has to go up here and then run it again. And it never actually gets set to false until 1 after 20, because it's greater than 20. So we could fix that by putting a greater than or equal to 20, which would then only run it exactly 20 times. And the other way to do this is we can also, instead of doing this here and then setting it to false here, is we can just put our conditional right inside, and like that. Because it's declared outside, it makes sense to do that. And we can save and run it. And we have to change this instead of greater than or equal to 20, because if it does greater than or equal to 20, then it will never run, because num times will never be greater than or equal to 20. So we have to change this to less than or equal to 20. And then when we run it, it then runs again 21 times. That's odd. Well, that would be because we want to make sure it doesn't run on the 20th time. So we only want a less than. And there we go. So there are a couple different things you have to change in order to, depending on where you put your conditional and what you're attempting to go for. And that's just something to think about. So the next kind of loop that we're going to look at is a do-while loop. So a do-while loop guarantees that the loop runs at least once. So like this here, where when we had the greater than symbol instead of the less than symbol, it never ran. So if you want to make sure it runs at least once, then you can do and then put your entire function. And we're going to put this inside of here. So it's going to do this while num times is greater than 1. And then we can also use Boolean operators so that we can test more than one thing. So it's going to be greater than 1 and num times is also going to be less than 20. So that ensures that it will run through this, add 1 to num times, and then, or actually we're going to change this to 3 first, because it shouldn't run. It will only run this loop up here, and then it ran, or actually let's set num times to 0 here as well. And you can't declare a variable more than once within the scope. So this scope has it declared here, and then we have to just redefine it here. And we can't declare it. And so we set it back to 0, and if num times is greater than 3, then it will run a second time, but it shouldn't do that because it should only be 1. So it prints working 1. So it went through here once, it wasn't greater than 3, and so it exited. However, if we change this to 1, and we save and run it, or greater than or equal to 1, and save and run it, then it will print 1 through 20 again. And that is how a do-while loop works. And that can be very useful in specific instances. And so the last loop type that we're going to look at is a for loop. And a for loop is very unique because it is a lot like a while loop and if statement all rolled into one. And it essentially is a counter. So the essential parts of a for loop are, and you declare an integer, and that integer is going to be I for this case, and make it 0 or 1 if you wanted to start at 1. And then this is your while portion of the statement. So while integer I is less than 6, then we're going to add to the integer. And so it will continue going through and declare the integer at the very, very beginning of before the for loop even starts. And then all while it goes through, while I is less than 6, it will run this code here. And then at the very end, it will add 1 to I. And then go through again. So this guarantees that the code will run 6 times. So we're going to put out sys out I. And save and run it. So it runs at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And that's basically how a for loop works. And you can use all of these methods together to run pretty much any code and determine what you want to do with your integers, and use those to run complex loops that allow you to create multiple different things very fast, or you can use them to come up with a number after many iterations and use random numbers. We'll get to that eventually in the next video. So as always, if you'd like to learn some more, we're going to have a next video here shortly on a guessing game, which will use random numbers and lots of loops and if statements in order to create a game that guesses which number that or allows you to guess which number that it's picked. And then when you win, it will either ask you to play again or quit. And we'll go over that next time. And as always, thanks for watching.